Good morning and welcome to the HCBS Act training for Illinois. I am Leanne Mull. I am with CQL. Presenting with me is Kathy Carmody, the CEO of the Institute on Public Policy. Carlos Espinoza, who is a self-advocate trainer as part of this project, was going to be presenting with us, but last week he got a full-time job working at O'Hare, so he was not able to be on the call, and we thought that was a fantastic reason to not be on the webinar. So we have all been congratulating him. He's working in cargo and he's absolutely thrilled. So what we wanted to start with is a polling question to find out who we have with us in the audience. This project was funded by the Illinois Council on Developmental Disabilities, and it was created for self-advocates and families to understand what is coming up in the new home and community-based setting rule. What we found, though, is providers are interested in the information as well. And so when we set up this webinar, even though it is primarily for self-advocates and family, we invited providers as well, just to get a basic knowledge of what is happening around HCBS. For your review, we will be putting up a recording of this so that you can show it to other interested parties at your organization. And at the end, we have allowed time for questions. So if you have questions, you can type them into the question box. Kathy Adamek from CQL and Seth Petrie are also on from CQL, helping to monitor questions and help with technical issues. So the first poll we're going to launch is who is here. We'd like to know, are you a professional, a self-advocate, a family member, all of the above? And so Kathy's going to launch that poll right now, and we'll leave that up for a minute or so while you fill that out for us so we know who's here. And we're going to take another couple of minutes, or another minute or so. We don't want to spend a lot of time on the polls because we have a lot of information to cover. Kathy, when it looks like it's ready to close, you can go ahead and close it. And can you review the results for us?
I can. So most of the people on the call are people who support people with disabilities, their support staff. There are many people on the call who indicated they're other. And then there are a few people who are family members, and there's no one on the call who is someone who is currently receiving services.
Okay, thank you very much. The next thing, we're going to do one more poll. I'll switch the screen so you have something else to look at while we're doing this, but we're going to do one more poll about how many people are watching with you. As you know, anytime you are doing a presentation, you like to know exactly how many people, and so what we've found is sometimes we have 8 people watching around one computer. So if you could let us know, Kathy's going to open the next poll, and if you could let us know how many people are watching with you, that would be good information for us to have, and we can share this information with you as well if you're on trying to see if there's a need for this, if you're under the other. And we're going to take about another 40 seconds. And then Kathy will close the poll and let us know what the results are. I like polls on webinars because then I have to pay attention. So if anybody else is like me and trying to multitask, not presenting though, you don't multitask when you're presenting, let me tell you.
So Leanne, most of the people are alone with their computer. There are a few people who have a couple of other people with them, 1 to 5 other people with them. And there's just probably 1 or 2 people that have more than 10 people with them around their computer.
Okay, I hope you're in a big office or a conference room and not crammed into a little office. Okay, so we are going to get started. The first thing that I'm going to do is talk a little bit about some of the definitions that are that CMS has come up with. Because in Illinois, we call home and community-based waiver group homes a CILA. In other states, they have other names. So a POCS, or provider owned or controlled setting, is what it's referred to in the actual settings rule. The rules that we're going to be talking about are specifically for CILA, when we're talking about residential, and day program. These rules do not apply to people who receive waiver services in their own homes, and they don't apply to people who live in ICF DDs. That is simply, it doesn't mean that the ICFs wouldn't want to implement these rules. They just don't have to follow them right now because they are funded by a different funding stream. So some of the rules that are coming down the pike, and this is 5 years out, but there are organizations in Illinois who are already doing this. It's getting in front of the bus. So the first new rule for providers is that anyone who lives in a CILA will need to have a lease. For the people who live there, that means that they are protected from having to move out of their home in the same way that people without disabilities are protected. When we talk with self-advocates and family members, just like if you were moving into an apartment, you want to make sure that everything that you want is in that lease. For providers, you want to make sure that everything that you expect is in that lease. It's a legally enforceable document. And I would say, are there any questions? If you have questions, you can type them in, and Kathy will let us know. Rule number 2 is people have the right to privacy in their bedroom if you live with other people, or in their house or apartment if they live alone. People have to have time for privacy. And if you're sharing a room with someone, that's kind of tough. We all know that we want people to have their own rooms. People have a right to have their own rooms. We understand everything that you're thinking about the funding. This is not about the funding. This is about what the rules are saying, what the right thing is to do. Now, some people we have found around the country have had roommates for so long they don't want their own room, and you know what, that's fine, but it's their choice, and they have to have the opportunity for privacy in their own room. The next new rule is people have a key to their house, to their bedroom, to their apartment. They have a key or a code to the front door of their house. This isn't but they might lose it. but they'll forget. This is the rule. It's our job to figure out how this is going to work for each individual person. Now, later on, we're going to talk about if there are restrictions. So I'm starting with the rules, and then we'll talk about the how to with the restrictions. I just want you to have an idea of what the rules say. 2B is people have the choice of living arrangements or a roommate. The ISC organizations, the service coordination organizations, the key to this is we have to ask the people what they want. A lack of complaint is not satisfaction. Most of the time, people, they've learned to stop asking. Think about us. If every time you ask me out for lunch, I say no, you stop asking. If every time I ask you out for lunch, you say no, I stop asking. If it never happens, I stop asking. And so many people who are in full life services, because of a myriad of reasons, the staffing crisis, funding, there's so many times they're told no, they have stopped asking. So what the new regulations have done is they're putting the onus on us as support to ask them what they want. Do you have a roommate? Do you want your own room? Do you have the privacy that you want? And if someone has a roommate, what are we doing so that they can have privacy? What if they want to have a romantic interlude? How are they going to do that if they do not have privacy? So what we've told the self-advocates at Speak Up, Speak Out for 2 years and in probably 30 trainings around the state is your ISC and your staff are going to ask you about this a lot. So think about what you want. And we as organizations need to start putting people in the positions where they make decisions. Across the country, many people who live in full life service did not get to choose what they had for breakfast this morning. And what's going to happen is we're going to be able to ask what they want to do for their schedules, who they want to live with, when they didn't get to choose what they had for breakfast or what they were going to wear. And so the onus is on us as providers to put them in situations where they can make some decisions, where they can make some choices. One of the most exciting things when we're presenting this to people who receive services is you have the freedom to furnish and decorate your room or house within the limits of the lease or other agreements. So, family members, people who receive services, when you're signing a lease, you need to read it, see what it says about painting. Many times, if I move into an apartment, many times the lease says you can do whatever you want within your 4 walls, as long as when you move out, you have, the walls are white again, and there's no picture hanging holes, none of that. It needs to go back to the way it was before you move out. And so for people receiving services and family members, you need to make sure that's what your lease says. For providers, if there's some reason that you don't want to provide that needs to be in the lease too, and can be negotiated just like any other lease or agreement. And again, if there's questions here, you can type them in. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. We included this cartoon because it's phenomenal from the Riot, which is a self-advocate newsletter, national self-advocate newsletter. You can see on the pictures, it says when Mandy found out about the new federal regulations, She showed her home providers that she had a few changes of her own to make. Okay? Think about if you are a provider or you visit providers, think about your CILAs and people's bedrooms. Now, do people get to choose their decorations? Did people get to choose their furniture? Do people's rooms look like Mandy's original room? Hey, she has the required twin size bed and something to put her clothes in. Okay, but look at the amazing difference when it's a home, not a room. Okay, this is their home. We work in their home. They do not live at our workplace. And so as you think about it, as you're going in or as you're visiting the homes that your organization runs, would you want to live there? That's the question that you want to be asking yourself. Not just the way it looks, not just the way it looks, but now we get into schedules and activities. You have the freedom and support to control your schedule and activities and have access to food at any time. It's hard to believe that that had to be written into a federal regulation, but it did. So many times we have, well, the kitchen closes at 7. I knew a man who had never been into the kitchen of his own home. Well, the staff work in the kitchen. I don't. Okay, can't even, the water cooler was outside of the kitchen so that people could get a drink of water when they wanted without going into the kitchen. And so talking about controlling your schedule, people do not have a bedtime. People have access to a TV and can watch TV as late as they want. If I could do a poll right now, I would say how many of you stayed up too late one night and had a hard time getting up in the morning? Okay, we do that as humans all the time. And you know what? We push through the day because we have to. This rule is for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I don't know about anybody else, but I've had some late nights in my younger years and went to work the next day. I don't do it anymore, and I only had to do it a couple of times before I learned. And so it's that natural learning instead of, no, your bedtime is 7 o'clock. No, I'm sorry, you can't watch the end of your show because you have to take your medication. Okay, it's that schedule. When we're talking about would you want to live in the homes where you are, that your organization is operating, would you like to live in the home where you're visiting? Not just about the beauty of the home, because most home and community-based settings that I've been in are gorgeous. But when you look at the schedules, do people get to choose what they want for their own life? So number 3, does staff support you for things you want to do? And do you like your schedule of activities and make changes as you want? Okay, how many of you on the call, again, not a polling question, just to think about, because I could have just done polling questions through the whole thing, but how many of you have had plans scheduled and then changed your mind on the plans? Okay, so you have access to food at any time. Yes, this is written in the rules. It means you have the right to food and drink when you want it. Now, when we're talking to people who receive services about this, the rule is not saying that you can, we're going to have candy everywhere and as much candy and chips as you want. But it also doesn't mean you can have a rice cake and plain yogurt for a snack or some crackers. People have the right to have the food and drink that they want. It's a basic human right. Okay, and their SNAP benefits are their SNAP benefits. I understand what we need to do, but can people have a choice in what what snacks they can have? What would they like? Can they go grocery shopping? And providers on the webinar, if you're thinking to yourself, well, we already know this, then I am applauding you right now. But the fact that they had to put all these things into a federal rule shows that it's not typical, that people do not have the right to food and drink when they want it, okay? Or they can drink water. Maybe can they have flavored water? You know, we could talk about that for hours. And believe me, when we're doing this presentation for people who receive services, we talk about that for a very long time, because the people are, what happens human nature? If you're told you can't have something, you know, you can't have Oreos. Okay, I'll have the whole package. Or, hey, you know, there's Oreos and no, I don't want that. I'd rather have, you know, an apple. Like that would ever really happen, but it might. Okay, so it's educating, not dictating. So the next rule that is interesting and that causes a lot of questions is people can have visitors at any time. Does that mean that someone can have an overnight visitor? Yes, it does. Does that mean that someone can have a visitor without prior scheduling? Yes, it does. People can have visitors at any time. Now, this is where we go back to the lease. This is where we talk to the people. When we're presenting this to people who receive services, we don't say, hey, have a party every night. We do say you need to talk with your roommates, because it's not fair to your roommate for you to invite strangers home or people who they don't know. And we have the rules for a reason. Everybody knows that. It's to keep people safe. We are really, really, really good at keeping people safe. But the new HCBS is saying, you know what, yeah, but we've gone kind of over to the far right. We need to come back to the middle, because right now, you know, and I don't make all of this is stuff I've heard. Well, we can't have somebody over because the staff said she doesn't want to watch them. She doesn't want to have to watch an extra person. And this happened in an interview with two women who live in their own home, and staff comes in and said, no, you can't have visitors. I'm not watching another person. Okay, so that's where it comes from. We should not need an FBI vetting for someone to have their friend over to their house. Finally, your home is physically accessible. Your home meets your needs for physical accessibility. It makes sense. It doesn't always happen, but now they're saying it has to happen. I'm sure that there's instances where someone acquires a physical disability and they still live in a home by their choice. But this rule, the physically accessible rule, is the only rule that cannot be modified. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is temporary restrictions. Do we have any questions, Kathy? Yadamak?
We do. We have a question about leases.
Yes.
And the question is the residential lease to the provider and to the individual occupants separately?
The lease is for, the provider has a lease for Yes, for the individual occupant. So Joe has a lease with agency A. Sam has a lease with agency A. They are all individualized leases. Did that answer that?
I think so. If it doesn't, well, the person will, if you would just put something else in the box that helps us to understand your question, that'd be great. And then this leads into what you're going to talk about next, Leanne. It says, what if the person uses the internet unsafely and they contact people who are not a good influence on them repeatedly?
Okay, so we're going to talk right now. Is that the only other question, Kath?
It is.
Okay, so we're going to answer that right now. The new rules provide for temporary restrictions for when people need support in things. So if we use the internet as example, or the question as an example, what we have to show is that we have tried every other everything possible before we put a restriction in place. So for the internet, has the person had classes outside the organization in internet safety? Every library, well, okay, I can't say every library in the world. I don't know. Most of the libraries in Illinois have a free internet program, an internet safety program, many of which were designed for seniors. A lot of the people we serve have a better grasp on the internet than seniors do. You can also reach out to your library and get personalized instruction, and I'm strongly suggesting from people outside the organization so that they can hear, it's not us as providers saying no, no, no. This is an outsider saying this is how you're generally safe. This is how you stay safe on the internet. If that does not work, that's when you can put into place temporary restrictions. They have to be temporary. They have to be measurable. They have to be revisited on a regular basis, which can be weekly, monthly. This is not a every 6 month we review and approve the same behavior program that's been in place for the last 20 years. This is not, we take this to a Human Rights Committee that has never rejected a plan. Okay, this is a true, this is everything we've tried. We, as an organization, have said, hey, probably not a good idea to contact those people. They might take advantage of you. That didn't work, so hey, let's take a class over at the library. That doesn't work, still doing it. And then it's talking to the person to say, do you understand? These are the ramifications, because any restriction has to be approved by the person. By the person. Okay, if the person has a guardian, the guardian can approve it, but it also has to be approved by the person. I hope that answered your question. It's really a whole different way of thinking about what we would do. Think about people without disabilities. Do you know anybody who's unsafe on the internet? I do. We all have those friends who are like, you did what? You went on, you're talking to who? Oh, you're talking to this person in this foreign country who's asking you to send money? Okay, true story, not a person with a disability. And in the end, still sends her money. Okay, but it happens with people with and without disabilities every day. It's a matter of not restricting, but teaching. And there may be some natural consequences involved. And I'm not talking natural consequences like physically unsafe. I'm talking about getting their heart broken, something like that. So if that didn't answer your question, then you can comment later. So I'm getting tired of listening to myself talk. I bet you guys are too. I'm going to hand this over to Kathy Carmody, and she is going to talk about the new rules for person-centered planning. Kathy?
Thanks, Leanne. No one ever gets tired of listening to you. I was waiting for you to laugh at that. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. As Leanne said, the HCBS ACT project really is geared towards educating non-professionals and the people that Leanne calls self-advocates. I call subject matter experts, because the folks who are living their lives every day receiving services really are the experts in what that experience is. And so the HCBS ACT project, funded through the Illinois Council on Developmental Disabilities, has really been striving to try and help folks understand as clearly as possible what's happening with the rule and what that means for them. Most recently, we've added the component that we're going to talk about here, which is the new person-centered planning process in Illinois. We can go ahead and go to the next slide, if you will. And Leanne is controlling the slide, so you're gonna hear me prompt. That's you. Sorry. You're gonna hear me prompting during my part of the presentation, so it won't be quite as smooth.
I was listening to you. Sorry about that.
Intently. So the next slide, I just absolutely love the slide. I know it doesn't reflect the communities that everybody lives in across the state of Illinois, but the notion that there's a lot of things that communities have to offer people, and a lot of contributions that people can make to their own communities. And really what the rule and what person-centered planning is striving to do is to say we want to make sure that people who receive services have the same opportunities as folks not receiving services to lead the life that they want to pursue. So this is really this slide we first used when we did a presentation at Speak Up, Speak Out on the same topic, and people really I think connected with it and at all the opportunities that were around them, and thinking about how person-centered planning could help them to really explore and pursue the life that they want to live, that maybe they haven't had the opportunity up until this point to think about. So we can go to the next slide. So person-centered planning is new here in Illinois, but not necessarily new across the country. As folks who are on the call probably know, we started piloting the person-centered planning process and tools in spring of 2017, starting in July of 2017. Then the ISCs across the state started actually using the planning tools, and by now, probably most agencies have had some exposure to it. Not everybody receiving services has yet had a plan developed for them, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I think we actually have a polling question following this slide, but we'll focus on this for a minute. So person-centered planning is really an approach that means that others should be asking you what's important to you, and how the people who are providing services to you can help you get the things that you want in life. And so it's really, we're sort of get a little hung up on some of the tools and some of the requirements, and those are important. But from the perspective of somebody receiving services, what the process really should do is enable people to have as much input and as much control over their lives while they're receiving agency services, and assure that those services are really geared towards what's most important for the person. So I want to ask Kathy Adamek if we can go to the next poll. And again, realizing that folks on the webinar may not be people receiving direct services, but even if you're not, if you're a service provider or have some other role in the service system, just wanting to know who's been involved in a person-centered plan so far. And if you're hosting a group of folks receiving services, maybe you can just kind of ask them around the room if anybody's been involved in a person-centered planning process yet. And we purposely put yes, no, and I'm not sure up there because what we have found from working, from training directly folks receiving services, is that some people were not aware that they had a plan developed for them, but they indeed had. And that would be a little concerning, right? Because people should be aware when that process is taking place so that they can assure that it's going to yield the outcomes that they're interested in having others know that are important to them. So I think we can go ahead and close the poll, and let's see if we've got some folks who have some experience. Okay, so good. A fair number of folks who are involved in the webinar have had some exposure to the planning process, so that's good to know. All right, we can go on to the next slide. So one thing that's important is, does person-centered planning mean I can have whatever I want? Suddenly the whole world is my universe, and you see from the slides there, or you see from the pictures there, money is no object, and in the top picture, if somebody lives in a rural part of the state, then there are going to be some limits on the sorts of things that they're going to have available to them, right? So it doesn't mean that you can have whatever you want in this world. It does mean that you can tell others what you want, and they will try and help you to get the supports you need to live the kind of life you want. We focus a lot on this issue in the different training events that we've done across the state. The rule definitely recognizes that communities vary widely. And again, I use the example of if you're in a setting in rural Illinois, the sorts of opportunities that you'll have immediate access to are generally going to be more limited than if you're in a urban or metropolitan area where you might have public transportation, or you might have a multitude of employment opportunities available to you. So the rule definitely recognizes that communities are different, and it in no way says that because you're receiving services, you should have access to things that aren't otherwise available within your community. What it really says is based on your community, you should not have limitations to what you can access because you're receiving services. And indeed, if you are living in rural Illinois and you want access to more amenities, you might work with people supporting you to say that you wanted to move to a different area. People certainly have that choice. But what person-centered planning means is that we should really find out what's important to you, and we shouldn't limit the things that you could consider just because you're receiving services. We can go to the next slide. So who is going to help me with person-centered planning? Everyone that receives HCBS, or Home and Community-Based Service waiver services, has an individual service coordinator, and that's the main person who will be helping develop the plan. It's important to know that that's not something that has to be done in isolation or without the support of other people who are important in your life. So others who can help are certainly family, the staff that may work with you, anyone else you want to include. When we were training at Speak Up, Speak Out, we talked a lot about folks might want a friend who they rely on to be a part of that process. I think many of us can imagine situations in our lives where we were having to make important decisions, and really developing a personal plan is an important decision. You are saying, this is how I want my resources to be directed. So many of us have probably had situations in our lives where we had to make important decisions, or where we were in a meeting that was going to have some consequences. You can imagine a medical situation, or a school or a job situation. And we wanted others who we trusted to be available to us. And that might be a peer who you really respected. That might be somebody, again, who worked with you, who you felt you could count on. So it's important, it's really important for all of us to understand that while the ISC is the person helping to develop and facilitate the plan, that doesn't mean that this activity takes place in isolation from other folks who are important to the person. And in advance of the planning process unfolding, it would probably be a good idea for people receiving services to talk with their family, talk with staff who support them, to find out, do you want others involved in this process? What role do you want them to play? And how can we make sure we support you in that? We can go to the next slide. So how does the process work? Person-centered planning begins with what's called discovery and assessment, and there is a tool for that process. I should emphasize that it isn't the intent that every area of someone's life, every question on the tool gets asked and answered as part of discovery and assessment. Discovery and assessment really should be seen as a starting point and then an ongoing process. The more we learn about somebody, what's important to them, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, where they see themselves heading in life, we can always add to that tool, and we can make that, you know, as robust and as informative as possible. But the purpose of discovery and assessment is to really tell other people who you are, what's important to you, sort of what you value, what you hope to have services help you to accomplish. It's not necessarily a commitment to saying, this is exactly what I want services to render for me. But it's really it's kind of like trying to get to know somebody, and from there, then taking the next step to saying, we have a sense of some of the things that are important for your life. Now we're going to focus on some specific areas in the service domain that we want to find out more about. So we can go to the next slide. So what if I'm not sure what to say? And Leanne made, I think, a reference to this earlier, and I think really did a good job of conveying and highlighting that for folks who haven't had an opportunity to assert some degree of control in their lives, being asked suddenly, some really important questions might be somewhat daunting to them. They might not be sure what to say. So we really encourage people, in advance, think about some things. What are you most proud of? Do you want help? Do you want help to get a job? Who can you go to if you need help or support? What makes for a good day for you? I think that's a really informative question. What do you do for fun? What should people who are assisting you know about you? Those are just some starting points, but there certainly are other general things that people can be thinking about so that they have something to share and offer as part of the planning process. And for agencies that work with people, I always say this would be a really good activity to be doing with people during day programming activities. Some self-examination, some self-discovery, and then people have that available to them as something to share as they're going through the person-centered planning process. Through the HCBS ACT project, we are actually working on some worksheets for people that they could do in advance of person-centered planning meeting so that they have thought about and can sort of share what they want others to know about them. I know I've had this experience, and maybe others have, where you have a conversation or a meeting and you think to yourself later on that day, that evening, the next day, I wish I would have said this, or I forgot to say that, or when they said this, I should have thought of something. And I think we've all had the experience of being unprepared for a meeting, a conversation, and wanting to be better prepared next time. And I think the importance of helping people receiving services to be prepared for their planning. I say meeting, I will get to whether there's a meeting, but the importance of having people have given some thought to what they want to convey to others and what they want to make sure others know about them. I think it's something that we all recognize the value of. And again, we're working on some tools that agencies could use, people could use, families could use to self-advocacy groups out there. I know there's many of them listening, could use as part of their activities so that people are prepared and make sure that the planning meeting is going to be as valuable as possible. We can go to the next slide. So what happens next? After learning more about you, your ISC will help you develop a personal plan that includes important information for those who will be helping you. This can include a meeting where you can invite the people that you want to help you make your plan. If you want to have a meeting, tell your ISC and he or she will help you plan it. So I've heard from both, I shouldn't say both, I've heard from really sort of all corners of the system across the state in Illinois that, and the person-centered planning process is new, and there's going to be a learning curve, and things will happen differently in a few months than what's happening today. So we all acknowledge and know that. But I think in some parts of the state or in some areas, then people are finding out that there isn't necessarily a meeting per se where people are coming together and where they are really finalizing a personal plan. And that may vary, again, from area to area across the state. The important thing for people who are receiving services to know is that if you want to have a meeting where you actually have your family and, again, maybe some peers or somebody who supports you, whomever you might want to invite to actually develop your personal plan, then that's your right to do so. And you should let your ISC know if that's something that you want to do so that that can get scheduled. And you can make sure that everybody who is important in your life to help you plan for what you want is able to be a part of that process. We can go to the next slide. And I think we need to click one more time there. So what happens to my personal plan? So your ISC will help you find an agency or people who can support you so that you can make the things included in your personal plan happen in your lives. So many folks who are having personal plans developed have been receiving services from a community agency, in some cases for a long time, in some cases for less time, but many people are already receiving services from an agency. And folks who are happy with the agency that's providing services to them can certainly continue on receiving those services. If you're new to the community system and you haven't been receiving services from an agency, then the ISC would share your plan with agencies that may be available to you to see if they think they could help you. And if they do, then you would meet with that agency and you would talk with them, and probably your family would be involved, to figure out which would be the best agency for you to choose. There may be other people who have been receiving services from one agency and choose to move to a different agency. That's not anything that's new with person-centered planning. That's always been something that's available to people who are served through the waiver. So if there was some issue, or maybe you were moving, maybe you're in Southern Illinois and you're moving to Central Illinois, that would probably necessitate you receiving services from a new agency. So those would be some instances where your ISC would help you to find an agency that is going to be the best match for you. And we can go to the next slide. So what if the people who are supposed to help me don't follow my plan? Your ISC will stay in touch with you and those who are supporting you to make sure that they're following your plan. If you have questions or concerns about the supports you're receiving, you can ask to meet with your ISC. So I always use the example of employment. I hope my example is as illuminating for you as I think it is. But, I use the example of if somebody wants to get a job and they have a community agency who says that, yes, I will help this person to get a job. That doesn't necessarily mean that the next day the person is magically employed. It doesn't mean that the community agency creates a job within their organization for the person. It means that the agency uses their resources and services to do things like connect the person to DRS, maybe have a job skills training class, maybe be part of a jobs club, maybe learn to use public transportation if that's available so that you can get to and from work. Maybe go out in the community to look at different jobs that exist in your area and help you figure out which one you might be qualified for and which one you might be interested in pursuing. So it's not that the agency is obligated to suddenly have somebody be employed. It's that the agency provides the supports that are going to help the person to achieve the outcome that they've identified for themselves. So if all those things are happening and the person doesn't yet have a job, that doesn't mean the agency isn't doing what they're supposed to. If, however, none of those things are happening and the agency hasn't provided some supports to help the person become employed, then there would be a question about, well, how is what you're doing helping the person to achieve the outcome that they've identified? And then it might be that services get realigned, or it might be that the person says, maybe this agency isn't the best fit for me. Maybe I need to see if there's another agency who has a better match with what I'm trying to accomplish. And we can go to the next slide. So if I have home-based services, will I have a personal plan? And yes, everyone who receives community supports, whether they live in their own home or own or a family home or with an agency will have a personal plan. At this point, people who are in receiving home-based services may not have had a full, well, they would have had a personal plan developed. They may not yet have an implementation strategy, which is what the provider of services develops to outline how they are going to provide services to the person. But that will be something that will happen in the home-based program. Right now, if somebody receives DT or SILA services and they've had a personal plan developed and they are receiving services from a provider agency, the provider agency develops what's called an implementation strategy, which describes how they are going to help the person to pursue the outcomes they've identified. And so when I gave the example about employment, those activities that I described that an agency may be providing would be examples of activities that that agency would probably have outlined in an implementation strategy, so that they can say, this describes how we are going to help this person to pursue their outcome. And at this point, folks in a home-based program don't necessarily have those for the services they're receiving in their own home. And we can go to the next slide. So when will person-centered planning start? It has started. It started on July 1st of 2017, and many people, as indicated by our poll, have had experience with the new process. If somebody who is part of the webinar receives services and hasn't had a personal plan yet, they can ask either their support staff or the ISC or a family when the planning process will begin for you, and they should be able to tell you that. We can go to the next slide. So new CMS regulations for person-centered planning. And one of the things I want to point out as we're talking about this is that CMS, which is the federal agency that oversees waiver-funded services, has emphasized that the 2014 rule, which Leanne was describing some of the components of earlier, also included language about person-centered planning and what's called conflict-free case management. What CMS has emphasized is that those two processes, person-centered planning and conflict-free case management, were not new to the 2014 rule. Those were expectations that had been in place by CMS, but what CMS realized was that in many places, including Illinois, those expectations weren't being met. So basically what CMS said was, these are not new requirements, but as long as we're writing this rule and as long as we've got your attention, we're going to go ahead and try and clarify some things that might not have been clear. So person-centered planning and again, a person-centered plan meeting, which is any person who wants to have that take place can tell their ISC that they want to have a meeting. And the person themselves should be as in charge of that process as they're able to be and want to be. They should be able to invite who they want. They can express the outcomes that are important to them in their lives. The plan should be provided to the person in a format that they understand. At this point, that is generally not happening in Illinois, and we understand that, but the intent is that as ISCs get more familiar and experienced with person-centered planning, then there's going to be some training and some information that will help them understand how they can translate that personal plan document into something that a person who maybe doesn't read is able to understand and use. And I think at this point, Leanne, I'm going to turn this back to you. Oh, no, well, we'll talk more. Sorry, I think I have the other slide back on my printed out. So person-centered plans, these are some good examples. You can see lots of pictures, some symbols, different things that folks might be able to better kind of connect to that express what's important to them. Now, this doesn't mean that the actual personal plan tool or form wouldn't be completed. That would be completed, and that would be sort of available to provider agencies, for the state for reviewing, but the documents that you're seeing on the screen right now would be examples of ways that the ISC may translate that information into something that's more accessible to the person themselves. And we can go to the next slide.
Okay, are there questions, Kathy Adamek, about the person-centered planning for Kathy?
Yes, Leanne, there are. One of the questions is, does the discovery tool for the person-centered planning have a deadline by which they have to be completed?
No. I'm sort of stumbling a little bit because the personal plan form itself is really the CMS mandated requirement. And so the discovery and assessment process and tool really should take place in advance of the development of a personal plan so that it can inform it, but it should be more of an ongoing and fluid process. So the deadline really is imposed upon the development of the personal plan. And I'm aware that in Illinois, I mean, typically that would be, on an annual basis. As Illinois is rolling out the new person-centered planning process, there have been a few sort of floating deadlines. So again, the process began July 1st of 2017, but for the duration, I want to say of the full that full fiscal year that we're in right now, which is fiscal year 18, then there can be amendments to an existing individual support plan. So rather than kind of rush through doing discovery and assessment and developing a personal plan, then the state did give permission for basically the extension of the current ISP with a deadline on it. And then during that extension period, the discovery and assessment process would be taking place and the personal plan would be getting developed.
Okay, thank you. And then this is kind of a statement, but I think it leads to a question. And the statement is, hopefully this plan is shared with all of the staff who are working with a person. So does the process speak to how that information, how the person-centered plan is distributed to other people in the person's life?
Well, presuming that the person is presently receiving services, then they have a current service provider. That service provider should be given a full copy of the personal plan. That provider, then there would be certain outcomes in the plan that have been designated, and the provider would identify which of those outcomes they're able to support the person to pursue. So for example, if you're a day service provider only and there were activities that would take place in the residential setting, you would not commit to carrying out those activities. However, you should have the full plan so you know kind of the full range of services the person is receiving. It would then be up to the provider agencies to assure that they share the information with whomever would need to know that about the person. So kind of the sharing of the personal plan within a community agency is really more incumbent upon the provider agency to make sure that people who need to have information to support the person have that information. However, the personal plan is going to be, I would say, generally speaking, a little broader in terms of direction about what staff would be doing. The direction for staff for how they would support the person really should be contained within the implementation strategy, which is developed by the provider agency. So for example, if somebody wanted to learn to cook, and that was an important thing, and they wanted to make sure that they were going to get services from an agency that would help them learn to cook, that might be identified as an outcome in their plan. However, the specific teaching strategies and schedule and sort of how that was going to happen wouldn't necessarily be outlined in the personal plan. That would be really fully up to the provider agency to design and then to put into an implementation strategy so that their staff know what to do.
Kathy?
And yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I lost you.
I'm done. Any other questions, Kathy? Otherwise, we can turn it over to Leanne.
Okay, so Kathy, there are no other questions on the person-centered planning, but Leanne, if we could go back to one, the lease. We did not answer the question that was asked.
Okay.
We didn't answer that question. So the question really is, are there two separate leases? Is there the provider that signs a lease with the landlord, and then the individuals sign a lease through the provider organization?
Yes. And a provider owner, Kathy Adamek, is that? Yeah, if the provider is renting a house in which to provide Scylla services, and it's being rented in the name of the provider, then they sign the lease with the owner of the home. Where the lease with the people come in, because it's a provider controlled setting, then it's almost like a sublet lease. Am I explaining that right, Kathy Adamek?
Yeah. Well, and Leanne, I'm going to jump in. This is Kathy Carmody, because I think more often than not in Illinois, providers don't lease property; they outright own the property.
Right,
so
most of the time. Some of them do lease, though. That's why.
Yeah.
But
so and in the instance where the provider owns it, then yes, they would have to have a legitimate lease. Many now have a sort of a service agreement with people receiving services. But what the rule calls for is a legitimate lease, as you said, with all the protections that a lease provides to people in terms of, they can't be evicted and, those sorts of protections.
Right. So did that answer the question? If you are a provider and you lease a home to run a Scylla in, then that's a separate lease with the owner of that home. But your lease is with the people for whom you're providing services and who are living in that home that you have leased.
And Kathy Adamek, this is Kathy Adamek, and I'll just add this as well. Part of the intent of this rule is to give more protections to the person who is leasing the apartment, who is living in the apartment. And so in some states, I understand it doesn't happen in Illinois a lot, but in other states, the person actually is the leaseholder for the residence. So it does happen in plenty of places where the person who receives services signs a lease with a landlord. It's not always through provider.
Right, and then a lot of the right, and then it's their own home. They've signed the lease, and they're bringing someone in to provide them services.
Right, and again, the intent of this is to provide protections to the person who's living there and receiving services. Okay, so then Leanne, there are two other questions that kind of refer back to when you were talking about the modifications.
All right.
And one of them, although it's written very specifically, I think the important thing, well, I'll read it to you and then I'll tell you what I think we should say in the answer. We are currently attempting to obtain Scylla services for a person that has gang affiliations. He spends his money on drugs, and the concern is, how do they keep the person, the other people he lives with, and the staff who support him safe? So I think that really, although we can't address individual issues, I think the real question is, when someone has a history of behaviors that are unsafe, what do we do in terms of modifying the rules?
Oh, are you going to? So for everybody who doesn't know, Kathy Adamek is my boss. And so I thought, Kathy, are you going to answer that?
Well, I'm happy to if you want me to.
Yeah, no, go ahead, because I was listening to the question, but I thought you were going to answer it.
Okay, so really, when there's a history, we have many people who have a history of behaviors that have gotten them into situations. All of our restrictions all the modifications have to be reviewed and looked at as a temporary basis. So you have to have a plan in place to evaluate the effectiveness of those things. But when there is a strong documented history of unsafe behaviors, you don't have to relive that. You can bring that history and base the restrictions on that history, provided that you are still looking at it as temporary, that you still have teaching strategies in place that will help the person learn to make different decisions or understand the consequences of their decisions, and evaluate that on a regular basis, thinking of it as temporary. So hopefully that answered the question.
And if the person, I'll add, if the person does not have a guardian, then really, does he want to be in SILA services? Do we want him to be with other people who, you know, or in the same neighborhood, and if he does have a guardian, then, you know, there may be another solution all the way around, given that specific event or that specific history coming in. What was the other question about restrictions, Kathy?
So this is a question, Leanne, specifically to you about your recommendations regarding people who need extensive supports and communicate in different ways.
So there is, CQL also has, there are ways to talk to people about this. The people who know the person the best, including their families, including their DSPs. A lot of times we're observing people. What makes them smile? What makes them, if they communicate through behavior, what is happening around them that is agitating? When we're doing the person-centered plan, people all have an opinion about whether they feel safe. They may not be able to express that with words, but if we know the person, I worked with a woman whose mother taught staff, if she crinkles her forehead, she has a headache. If she pulls at her hair, she has a headache. If she says she's dry, it means she has to go to the bathroom. It's that the people who know the person the best. It may be, I'm tapping the side of my face because my tooth hurts, because I'm agitated. Or it can be, look, I look completely peaceful when I have this type of music playing or that type of music playing. I mean, I can tell you a story of a man who had one-on-one supports, and I know this doesn't happen in Illinois often, but he had one-on-one arm's length supports because he ate his clothes. He could not go to a traditional day program. He had a one-on-one in-home day program, and when we went in to do an interview with him, a full 21-question interview, although he did not say a word, when we were asking him about his family and his one-on-one answered, he stopped eating his clothes. And so we knew, okay, look, he loves talking about his family or listening to the things that he does with his family. And then we find out that his most favorite thing in the world is to bounce up and down on a yoga ball. But because we want to keep people safe, he fell off the yoga ball, so the yoga ball got taken away. And you know what happened when the one-on-one started talking about that? He started eating his clothes again. And so that's how it's observation and talking to the people who work with the person 24 hours a day. And I'm happy to give, we can give some CQL resources around that. We're actually developing some about communication. Did that answer your question? Or did that answer the question?
I think it did. If not, she'll write more in the question box. So.
Okay, do we have more questions?
Nope, we're good.
All right, let's talk about day program. So the rules are not just for residential, they are also for day programs. So Kathy's going to talk in a minute about the new rules in Illinois, because Illinois actually responded to this, not the way, of course we would like unlimited funds to do all this, but at least we're on the right track. So day program needs to offer things, a chance to do things outside of the day program building, like shopping or work or activities. And I actually heard a CEO say, well, wouldn't I love to have a day like that? Well, the people we serve are not getting paid. So if they're in day program, they're not getting paid. They should be able to go out and do things just like we would do were we not getting paid for what we do during the day. So Kathy's going to talk a little bit about a couple of new programs in Illinois. We'll finish it up and take some more questions. Kathy Carmody? Are you there? So while Kathy's unmuting.
No, I'm sorry. That's exactly what I'm doing. I'm trying to be a good presenter, and I was well into my pitch here. I'm sorry. So we'll take a look at this slide, and then we're going to do a poll, and then take a look at one more slide before I hand it back. So as folks may be aware, then the Illinois Adult IDD HCBS waiver has been approved by CMS. That waiver does include a new day program option for adults called Community Day Access and Employment Task Services. Community Day Access has two billing codes, site-based and non-site-based. So site-based would be more of the traditional site-based DT, and then the other sort of opportunity is for people to do things more in the community and off-site from the DT program. There's a lot of that taking place right now across the state in day programs, and I think the state recognizes that. They wanted to encourage agencies that perhaps don't have as many of those opportunities available to consider developing those for people who want to receive day services. The intent is to increase opportunities for people to access community settings during day programs. We'll see what happens, because unfortunately there isn't going to be a higher rate for providing services in the community versus at a site. So one of the things the state is doing is asking agencies, and it hasn't started yet. I believe it'll start. I talked to the state. They don't have the billing codes developed yet. But I think they want to see, for people who are in day services, how much of their time is being spent off-site in community settings, such as a library, a park, doing recreational activities. So just, again, accessing the community in the same way that people who don't have disabilities access the community. We're going to go to a poll next, Kathy, if you can launch the final poll for the day. And again, knowing that we have folks who are not necessarily receiving services on the phone, I think we're asking you to respond for people that you support, if they go to a workshop or a day program during the day, and others may go to jobs, and others may be retired, but just wanting to know if we've got folks connected to the webinar who are using day program or workshop settings. So we'll give you a minute to respond to that. Okay, Kathy, you want to see what our respondents said? Okay, so we've got about a quarter of the respondents are not going to a workshop or day program during the day, and then others are affiliated with either an organization or they themselves are doing that. So it's good to know. If we can move on to the next slide. One of the things, I'm going to go off script a little bit here and just talk about sort of what's happening nationwide with day programs and workshops, because people are probably aware that there's a lot of attention being focused on those settings and a lot of question about, do those settings comply with the 2014 rule. Leanne gave some examples of some requirements that those programs have, and I think it's going to share some more. But this is an area that I think is still unfolding across the country in terms of what's going to happen to those sort of large congregate disability-specific settings once the 2014 rule does become the law of the land. And you know, really the answer is we'll see. And there's not much more clarity we can put to it at this point. There certainly is a movement of trying to refocus resources to help people become employed in the community, and that's what we're going to talk about here. That doesn't mean that every one of those larger settings has closed or is closing. It means that there really is an effort to try to assure that employment is really a meaningful and viable opportunity for people who receive services. So one of the prongs in that work is the WIOA, or Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, that was passed in 2016. And WIOA is a federal requirement, so it's not Illinois specific. It aims to increase employment opportunities for many people, including those with disabilities. So it is not targeted exclusively on people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but really looks to promote employment for anybody who's of working age. And the intent is to promote competitive, integrated employment for all people. Competitive and integrated employment means jobs in the community, not in a separated setting, at fair market wage, not at a sub-minimum wage, and that the person really has the opportunity to pursue employment in the community. The WIOA rule restricts access to sub-minimum wage employment for youth who are age 24 and under with disabilities until they've had vocational rehabilitation and career counseling services. And what the intent here is to assure that people have information about other opportunities besides sub-minimum wage before they choose to pursue that opportunity. And so the requirement for youth was that people could not just go from school to a workshop setting or a sub-minimum wage setting. Before they chose that opportunity, they would have to have, and they do have to have, information and training and exposure so that they know what other opportunities are available to them. Older people, I say older, I only mean older than 24, older people with disabilities who are at sub-minimum wage employment now must have regular access to career counseling and self-advocacy education. And so what WIOA said was that they weren't going to eliminate the sub-minimum wage certificates. They weren't going to close down every workshop. They didn't want to say nobody can ever have this opportunity. But what they wanted to say was that they wanted to make sure that if somebody was in a setting like that, they had information and training so that they knew what their alternatives were. And, we always kind of use the example, if you've only ever, eaten at McDonald's, you don't know whether you like someplace else because you don't know, you don't even know it exists. So WIOA, really the intention is to make sure that people have information and have it conveyed to them in a meaningful way so that they truly understand that there are alternatives to what they may have experienced up to this point in their life. And then the self-advocacy training is also required so that people, develop the skills to be able to share with others what they want and to try and actually pursue it. So this is underway in Illinois right now. The Division of Rehab Services, is the state agency responsible for providing the career counseling. Many organizations may have experienced that with DRS already, And then I know, for example, the Alliance is one of the organizations that's done a good deal of self-advocacy education for people as well. And with that, Leanne, I'm going to turn this back to you, I think, for a few more slides before I have one final one.
Okay, a couple more things about day services. The CMS requirements are people have to have a secure place to put their personal items, like a locker. There can't be places where people are not allowed to go. Do you have a staff bathroom at day program? Can people talk during breaks and meal times? Can they talk to the people who they want to talk to? Is one of the questions. Do you get to spend, one of the rules is people spend time without people with disabilities. People spend time with people who they want to. We as staff get to eat lunch with whoever we want. Do the people who receive services? One of the questions is, people have access to the same food and drink as staff or visitors. If the staff can buy pop-in snacks, can the people buy pop-in snacks? What if somebody wants to eat their snack early? Can you eat where you want? If I'm having a tough time at work and I don't feel like eating with anybody, I can go out to my car. What happens with people who receive services? They're having a tough day at work and they have to go to lunch with the same people who they're working with, who are causing their tough day at work. So one of the requirements is people have access to a private place for work. Now, we're not talking about, you know, a private dining area with white linen tablecloths, but can they eat in a boardroom if they're having a tough day? Can they eat in somebody's office? It's that individualized. 99% of the people who we work with are perfectly fine eating lunch with the people they're eating lunch with. But we all work with people who would, you know, you give them that a couple minutes of alone time and you're going to have a great day. Otherwise, they're going to take the next 8 hours of your life. And so this is all about individualized services, and it's all written in the CMS settings rules. So Kathy is going to finish this up and talk about when is all this going to happen and what's happening actually in the state. We'll finish up with your questions, and then our time together is almost over.
Great, thanks, Leanne. So folks may be aware that the original time frame for complying with the new requirements of the CMS HCBS rule was March 17th of 2019. In 2017, last spring, governors received a letter from CMS informing them that they were extending that time frame to the year 2022 because the new administration felt that there was concern on the part of many states as to whether or not they would be able to meet the new requirements. So CMS has committed that they remain committed to the new requirements themselves, but they recognize that postponing the enforcement date will allow states more time to meaningfully plan for being able to come into compliance. We also know from CMS, though we haven't seen it yet, that they are issuing what's called sub-regulatory guidance on the 2014 rule that should be coming out in the very near future, providing some further explanation and interpretation regarding primarily the heightened scrutiny process. So there has been some concern and confusion across the country, certainly not just concentrated here in Illinois, regarding primarily the question of, you know, how do you define community, and do people experience community if they're in a larger setting? Is that possible? And how are states evaluating that? So CMS will be giving some further clarification that I'm sure through the HCBS Act project we will be deciphering and trying to put into some understandable context once we receive that. All states had to submit a plan to CMS when the new rule came out, informing them how they intended to evaluate services in their state to determine whether they were in compliance, what systemic changes they intended to make, and what they were going to do if they found that services did not meet standards. That was called is called a state transition plan. CMS then reviewed those plans and is either approving them or telling states, you need to focus in this area or you need to add this to your plan. Illinois is one of 11 states at this point, which has not yet received initial approval from CMS for our state transition plan, which means that CMS is still reviewing it. They are still in communication with the state, talking back and forth, and we expect sometime in the first half of 2018, we will get initial approval from CMS for the Illinois State Transition Plan. Now, what the initial approval may contain is a letter outlining other steps that CMS is going to require the state to take in order to get the final approval for their plan. So when I caution that we may get initial approval, that doesn't necessarily mean that CMS is saying that everything that Illinois proposed is completely fine. It may be, as has been the case in most other states, that CMS gives the state several areas that they want them to either focus on differently, provide more detail on. That's pretty much been how they've approached the approval process in other states. So, and again, through the HCBS Act project, I know we will keep tabs on those two topics and make sure that as we hear back from CMS in those two areas, that we get that information out to people. And back to you, Ann.
Okay, so do we have any more questions? What we tell self-advocates or people who receive services, you can share this information with your service providers. So on our call, if you're a service provider, you can share this information with families. We can share this with legislators. We, at the last Going Home rally, we were talking to some legislators, never have no idea that this is out there. So as we're talking about going home or try to do rebalancing, it's educating people about what is coming down the pike and the new rules. We have families who are nervous. Their kids have not been out. They love the service provider because people are safe, and we want people to be safe. But people receiving services who do communicate with words have said, I want a life in my community. And a lot of this is where this is coming from. So any further questions?
So there are a few questions. We're almost at the end, Leanne. So well, I guess we'll answer as many as we can. The first one is a question about what are the resources or where can I find programs or facilities that are person-centered for people that I care about?
Well, and this is Kathy. I'm glad to jump in. I think the effort to assure, I kind of distinguish between person-centered planning and person-centered practice, and I think person-centered practice is really impactful in the lives of people receiving services. And I think that that's an area that there's been growing training and attention being focused on. I know the state had sponsored a series of forums last year that were very well attended from agencies wanting to learn more. And I think it is kind of an evolutionary process. I think agencies are trying to shift their focus. And so I don't know that there's necessarily a listing, but I think, if it's a family member or an ISC or a person receiving services, I think just talking to an agency and finding out, how do you approach some of these issues? What are some of the opportunities my family member is going to have here? It might be more of kind of a getting to know somebody process versus sort of a listing that says these organizations describe themselves that way. I think the other, and I'll put in the shameless plug for CQL, you guys are probably going to do it anyways, but I mean, I think if you've got a CQL accredited organization, then that is a person-centered organization because CQL doesn't accredit them if they're not. So I think that's another really good indicator. That's
true, and in Illinois, we're lucky enough to we have a parent group. So if it was a parent who asked that question, there's a parent group called Illinois Parents of Adults with Disabilities. They have a Facebook page where you can get opinions from families on their service providers, other service providers. You can, the Illinois Self-Advocacy Alliance, you can get, if the person is a self-advocate who you're looking for services for and wants to help choose their services, they can ask on there. Organizations that have advocacy groups. So I hope that answered the question. What other questions do we have, Kathy Adamek?
So we also have a question about, are leases, do leases have to be legal documents, or can the document be created by the provider organization?
The document can be created by the provider organization, but it's still a legal document. Okay. And so a landlord can, you know, Joe Schmo landlord can create his own lease. But it has to have all the elements required in your county. And so counties have different lease requirements. The lease requirement has to be designed so that it can be understood by the person who's receiving services and their guardian. Another question, I'm kind of answering short.
Do the new regulations apply to both private as well as state-operated agencies?
Absolutely. If you are a DHS accredited, if you are an accredited organization, receive funding from the state, it applies to you.
I'm going to jump in, Leanne. I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
I'm going to jump in because I know we had some of our participants on the webinar are employees of state-operated developmental centers. So as a reminder, the requirements only apply to home and community-based services funded through the waiver. So a state agency setting, which would be an SODC, doesn't meet that requirement, and therefore these requirements don't apply.
Right, those are ICFs.
Right.
Although you can implement them even though they're ICFs.
Sure.
I can help with that. Start an advocacy group. Anyway, any other questions?
So the only other question that we have is a question about if somebody damages the house, who's responsible, the provider or the person?
Well, you're going to have a lease. And I know in Illinois there are movements to try to make it so Kathy, you know about this, right? They were trying to get rules or legislation so that the family has to pay, but that would be something you would put in the lease. And families, that would be something you want to see if it's in the lease.
Sure. Who's
going to be responsible? Are they going to split the cost? How does that work?
Yeah, and I think, you know, Leanne, if I damage my rental unit, then I pay for it, right? I mean, that is that's part of the obligation of a lease. That's part of the, you know, you have protections, but you also have obligations. I was going to say I'm also aware that in the waiver renewal, then the state included a program where if there is property damage under certain circumstances, then the provider agency could apply to the waiver for reimbursement for repair. So that is something that's new in the waiver and may become an opportunity for people as well.
Right. I thought that they just implemented something like that. Any other questions?
No, thank you, Kathy and Leanne. That concludes all the questions that we have from this session.
Okay, and I don't think we have a slide with our contact information on it, but you can connect with us through CQL, Kathy Adamek, or
HCBS Act website.
That's correct. When you'll be getting an email with the PowerPoint, and we can include in that the CQL website. You can go there and find a way to contact us.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody, for sticking with us. Enjoy your lunch, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks
Thanks,
again.
everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks for everything you do for people with disabilities.
Indeed.